The wind screamed like a banshee clawing at the windows of the 24-hour diner, a lonely bastion of light against a world dissolving into a maelstrom of white. Naomi traced a lazy circle on the condensation of the glass, her gaze lost in the hypnotic swirl of the blizzard. It was 2 a.m, the hour when ghosts and regrets came out to sit in the empty vinyl booths. At 27 and 7 months pregnant, her feet ached with a deep, rhythmic protest, a pain that radiated up her spine and settled in her lower back. The light orange of her uniform felt too thin, a flimsy shield against the cold that seeped through the building's old bones, and her white apron was stained with the day's battles of ketchup and coffee. Her boss, a wonderfully pragmatic woman named Pearl, had insisted she go home hours ago. "No one's coming out in this, honey," Pearl had said, her voice raspy with concern. "Go on. Get home to your feet," but the ancient engine of Naomi's sedan had coughed its last protest 2 days ago, and the thought of walking 6 blocks in this tempest, of risking a slip on the ice, was a fear that outweighed the exhaustion. So she had stayed, nursing a lukewarm tea and promising herself she'd leave the second the snow showed a moment of mercy. The bell above the door, a tiny brass thing that usually offered a cheerful jingle, suddenly shrieked as a gust of wind tore the door open. A figure stumbled in, more pushed by the storm than walking, bringing with him a vortex of snow and ice. He collapsed onto the checkered linoleum floor, a dark, crumpled shape against the cheerful red and white. For a heartbeat, Naomi was frozen by a primal fear. Then instinct, sharpened by a life of looking after others, took over. She moved from behind the counter, her steps careful, her hand instinctively resting on the gentle swell of her belly. The man was dressed in a suit that, despite being torn and soaked, was made of a material so fine it seemed to drink the diner's soft light. Blood, dark and stark, stained the pristine white of his shirt near his ribs. His face, when he turned it towards her, was a mask of pain and tightly controlled fury, with sharp, intelligent eyes that were now clouded with shock. He was Korean, with features that looked as if they were carved from granite and determination. He tried to push himself up, a low groan escaping his lips. "Don't move," Naomi said, her voice soft but firm, cutting through the howl of the wind. "You're hurt." He looked at her, truly looked at her then, and a flicker of disbelief crossed his face, as if seeing a pregnant woman in a cheap orange dress was the most surreal part of his entire night. He watched her with the predatory stillness of a cornered wolf, his eyes cataloging every detail of the small diner, every potential threat. The chrome napkin dispensers, the worn Formica countertop, the faded posters advertising milkshakes for a price that hadn't existed in a decade. And her. This woman, with her calm eyes and the gentle curve of her stomach, who was approaching him not with fear, but with a quiet, unnerving competence. "Stay back," he rasped, the words a raw tear in the air. His hand moved weakly towards the inside of his jacket, a gesture she instinctively understood. Naomi stopped, holding her hands up in a placating gesture. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Naomi. You're bleeding all over." Pearl's clean floor, a ghost of a smile touched her lips, a small, disarming thing. The absurdity of her statement seemed to momentarily break through his wall of pained aggression. He slumped back slightly, the effort to remain vigilant costing him more than he had. "There's a first aid kit behind the counter," she continued, her voice maintaining its soothing cadence. "And I make a pretty good cup of hot water with lemon. Let me just help you into a booth." He didn't agree, but he didn't refuse either, which she took as permission. She moved carefully, retrieving the green plastic first aid box and a bowl of warm water. She knelt beside him, the linoleum cold against her knees. "I need to see the wound," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. He hesitated, his jaw tight, a war playing out behind his eyes. In his world, vulnerability was a death sentence. Trust was a currency he had stopped trading in long ago. But the relentless throbbing in his side and the encroaching cold that had nothing to do with the blizzard were making their own arguments. He gave a stiff, almost imperceptible nod. With gentle, practiced hands, Naomi eased back the sodden fabric of his jacket and shirt. It was a deep, ugly gash, more of a slice than a puncture, bleeding sluggishly. It wasn't a bullet wound, she noted with a sliver of relief. A knife, maybe. "This needs stitches," she stated plainly, cleaning the edges with an antiseptic wipe from the kit. He flinched, a sharp intake of breath hissing between his teeth. "There are no hospitals open in this storm," he ground out. "No ambulances on the road, I know," she said simply, her focus entirely on the task. "But we have to stop the bleeding. Hold this." She pressed a thick gauze pad against the wound, guiding his hand to hold it in place. His fingers were cold, but his grip, even weakened, was firm. They were trapped, two strangers in a bubble of warm light, while the world outside raged. The storm had sealed them in, erasing the roads, the city, everything but the hum of the old refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of the clock above the kitchen pass-through. After Naomi had cleaned and bandaged his wound as best she could, she had helped him into the corner booth. He sat stiffly, his expensive, ruined suit a stark anomaly against the cracked red vinyl. She placed a steaming mug of broth in front of him, something she'd found in the back from Pearl's emergency stash. He hadn't told her his name. He hadn't told her anything. He just watched her, his dark eyes missing nothing as she moved around the small space, refilling the sugar shakers, wiping down counters that were already clean. It was a nervous energy, a need to do something familiar in a situation that was anything but. "You're not afraid of me," he said finally. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact, laced with a faint note of surprise. Naomi paused, a cleaning rag in her hand. She looked at him, at the hard lines of his face and the lingering pain in his eyes. "Should I be?" she asked, her voice genuine. "People who look like you usually have people they pay to bleed for them." His lips tightened into a thin line. "You're observant. I'm a waitress," she corrected gently. "Observing is the job. I know who wants a refill before they ask, who's on a bad date, and who's trying to skip out on the bill." She turned back to the counter, her movements slow and deliberate. "You, on the other hand, you look like you're the one who sends the bill." A low, rough sound that might have been a chuckle escaped him. Something like that, a comfortable silence settled between them, punctuated by the howling wind. Naomi finally sat down in the opposite booth, a weary sigh escaping her. She rubbed her lower back, a familiar ache settling in. "Why are you still here?" he asked, his gaze softening slightly as he watched the unconscious gesture. "Shouldn't you be home?" "Car's dead. And my home is a 6th-floor walk-up. The thought of climbing those stairs right now." She trailed off, patting her belly. "He's been active all day. I think he likes the sound of the storm." He looked at her stomach, a flicker of an unreadable emotion in his eyes. "You're alone?" The question was quiet, almost hesitant. "The father isn't?" "He got scared," Naomi said, her voice devoid of pity or bitterness. It was just a fact, like the storm outside. A baby is a big storm, too. Not everyone is built to weather it. He looked down at his own hands, resting on the tabletop. He was a man who commanded storms, who created them, who thrived in chaos. Yet, listening to her, he felt a profound sense of inadequacy. Her quiet strength, her simple acceptance of her reality, was a force more formidable than any he had ever encountered. As the night wore on, the cold from the outside began to win its war against the diner's old heater. A fever bloomed on the man's skin, a dry, dangerous heat that radiated from him. His earlier stoicism began to crumble, replaced by a delirious shivering. His breathing grew shallow, and when Naomi touched his forehead, the heat was alarming. "Hey," she said softly, trying to get his attention. "Talk to me. What's your name?" He looked at her, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "Minjun," he mumbled, the name a foreign, beautiful sound in the quiet diner. A string of Korean words followed, spoken in a pained, urgent whisper. She didn't understand them, of course, but she understood the universal language of suffering. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to prick at the edges of her calm, but she pushed it down. Panicking wouldn't help him. It wouldn't help her baby. She remembered Pearl's remedies for everything, a folk wisdom passed down through generations. "Fever needs to sweat out," Pearl would say, "and the body needs fuel to fight." She went into the small, cramped kitchen. She found blankets in a storage closet, thick, dusty wool ones used for covering pipes on the coldest nights. She found ginger and honey for tea, and the last of the chicken for the broth. She worked with a silent, determined efficiency, her earlier exhaustion forgotten, replaced by a singular focus, keeping this stranger, this Minjun, alive through the storm. She draped the blankets over him, tucking them in tightly around his shivering frame. She coaxed him to sip the hot, sweet tea, holding the mug to his lips. He was mostly unaware, lost in a fevered dream of another world, a world of shadows and violence she could only imagine. He muttered names she didn't know, his hands occasionally clenching as if grasping a weapon. At one point, in a moment of startling clarity, his eyes focused on her. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong. "They'll find me," he whispered, his voice hoarse with fear. "They'll use you. No one's finding anyone in this blizzard," Naomi said, her voice a steady anchor in his delirium. She placed her free hand over his. "You're safe here. I won't let anything happen to you. Just rest." The simple certainty in her voice seemed to reach him. The tension in his grip loosened, and his eyes fluttered shut. He drifted back into the fever, but his breathing seemed a little easier. Naomi sat with him through the long, dark hours, dozing in the booth opposite him, waking at every sound, every shift in his breathing. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a guardian, a protector of this broken man who had stumbled out of the storm and into her care. The first pale, gray light of dawn filtered through the snow-caked windows, painting the diner in hues of lavender and steel. The world outside was silent, the blizzard having finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a pristine, muffled landscape. Naomi woke with a crick in her neck, her body stiff from sleeping upright in the booth. Her first thought was of him. She looked across the narrow aisle. The booth was empty. The wool blankets were folded neatly on the seat, a perfect, crisp square. Minjun was gone. A cold knot of disappointment tightened in her chest. She stood up, her body protesting, and walked over to the booth. There was no note, no word of thanks, nothing to suggest the harrowing night they had shared had ever happened. It was as if he had been a fever dream, a figment of her tired imagination. Except he wasn't. On the table, tucked neatly under the salt shaker, was a stack of money. She picked it up. They were $100 bills, crisp and new. She counted them automatically, her fingers numb. 10 of them. $1,000. It was more than she made in 2 weeks of grueling shifts. It was enough to fix her car, to buy the expensive crib she'd been dreaming of, to ease the constant, low-grade panic about money that hummed beneath the surface of her days. And yet it felt like an insult. It felt like a payment for services rendered, a cold, impersonal transaction that erased the genuine human connection, the fear and the care that had filled the small space during the storm. He saw her as just another problem money could solve. A wave of weariness washed over her, heavier than any physical exhaustion. She had expected nothing, she told herself. He was a man from a different world, a world where $1,000 was probably pocket change, a convenient way to close a chapter and walk away clean. Why should she be surprised? She pocketed the money, the crisp edges feeling alien and wrong in her uniform pocket. The diner felt cavernously empty now, the silence he left behind far louder than the storm had ever been. She did her closing duties on autopilot, her mind replaying the night, searching for clues she might have missed. The intensity in his eyes, the vulnerability when the fever took him, the way he had said her name. Had she imagined it all? Locking the diner door behind her, she stepped out into the transformed world. The snow was deep and beautiful, muffling the city's sounds into a peaceful hush. The walk home was cold but quiet, giving her too much time to think. She felt foolish, used, a temporary port in his personal storm. He had washed up on her shore, and now that the tempest had passed, he had simply sailed away. Naomi's apartment was small, but it was hers. It was a sanctuary of second-hand furniture, thriving plants, and the faint, hopeful scent of baby powder from the supplies she was slowly accumulating. She had slept for most of the day, a deep, dreamless sleep of pure physical and emotional exhaustion. When she woke, the late afternoon sun was casting long, golden shadows across her living room floor. It was the low, persistent rumble that first registered, a vibration she felt in the floorboards before she heard it. It grew steadily, a sound so out of place in her quiet, working-class neighborhood that it pulled her from her drowsy state. She went to the window, pushing aside the pale, yellow curtain. Her breath caught in her throat. The street below, usually lined with aging sedans and a few pickup trucks, was now occupied by a silent, gleaming fleet of black luxury cars. They were parked with military precision, bumper to bumper, lining both sides of the street for as far as she could see. They were like a pack of obsidian panthers, sleek, powerful, and utterly terrifying in their silent uniformity. Neighbors were peering out of their own windows, phones up, recording the unbelievable spectacle. A few brave souls stood on their porches, whispering and pointing. Naomi counted them, her mind struggling to process the scene. There had to be over 100. 135, she thought, her heart beginning to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs. Then, the door of the lead car, a vehicle longer and blacker than any she had ever seen, opened.
Mignon stepped out.
He was no longer the bleeding, disheveled man from the diner. He was wearing a dark gray suit tailored to perfection, a crisp white shirt, and an expression of such calm, commanding authority that he seemed to suck all the air from the street. He looked up, his eyes finding her window instantly, as if he had known exactly where she would be. He wasn't just a businessman. He wasn't just a criminal. He was something else entirely.
A king.
A titan. A force of nature more intimidating than any blizzard. Two other men, equally imposing in their own dark suits, flanked him. He said something to them in Korean, his voice too low to carry, and then he started walking towards her apartment building. The purpose in his stride was absolute. He was coming for her. The $1,000 on her dresser suddenly felt like the most naive, pathetic gesture in the world. She hadn't sheltered a man. She had sheltered a storm, and now it had followed her home. He didn't knock. A soft, polite rap echoed through her small apartment, a sound completely at odds with the overwhelming display of power on the street below. Naomi's hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. She opened it just a crack, the security chain still in place. Min-jun stood in the hallway, his presence seeming to shrink the already narrow space. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a flicker of something she couldn't name. Regret, perhaps, or apology. "Naomi," he said, his voice a low, steady baritone. "May I come in?" She should have said no. She should have slammed the door, called the police, screamed. But looking at him, she saw the ghost of the vulnerable man who had shivered with fever in her diner booth. She saw the man whose life she had held in her hands. Slowly, she unlatched the chain and opened the door. He stepped inside, his expensive leather shoes silent on her worn wooden floor. He took in her small apartment in a single, sweeping glance, the mismatched armchair, the stack of parenting books on the coffee table, the single photo of her and Pearl laughing together. His gaze was intense, as if he were trying to memorize the details of her life. "The money," he began, his voice tight. "It was an insult. I apologize. In my world, it is the only language I was taught for situations I do not understand. It was a clumsy, foolish gesture. What world is that exactly?" Naomi asked, finding her voice. She gestured vaguely towards the window. "The world where you need 135 cars to run an errand?" A faint smile touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The world I wish I had never brought to your doorstep. I came to thank you properly. You saved my life." Before she could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and the fleeting softness on his face vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. "There is a complication," he said, his voice dangerously low. He turned to face her fully, his eyes locking with hers. "The man who did this to me, he was a business associate. A man named Thorne. He betrayed me. My men have just informed me that Thorne has learned where I was last night. He knows about the diner. He knows about you." A cold dread, far more terrifying than the blizzard, washed over Naomi. "Me? What do I have to do with any of this?" "To a man like Thorne, you are not a person," Min-jun said, his voice laced with self-loathing. "You are leverage. A weakness he can exploit. The simple, safe life she had worked so hard to build, the quiet world she was trying to create for her unborn child, was shattering. The violence of his world had followed him through the diner door and was now seeping into hers. "I will not allow him to harm you," Min-jun stated, the words a solemn vow. "You and your child will be protected. You have my word." The transition from her cozy, cluttered apartment to his penthouse was like being thrown from a lifeboat into the cold, vast expanse of the ocean. His home was a testament to wealth and power, a sprawling space of glass, steel, and minimalist furniture high above the city. The floor-to-ceiling windows showcased a breathtaking panorama, but Naomi felt no awe, only a profound sense of displacement. She felt like a common sparrow trapped in a golden cage. He had insisted she come with him, arguing it was the only way to guarantee her safety. His men, silent and efficient, had packed a bag for her with a disconcerting speed, and now she sat on a stark white sofa that probably cost more than her car, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she hadn't asked for. She was a prisoner, albeit a well-cared-for one. Minjun stood by the window, his back to her, speaking in rapid, guttural Korean on his phone. He was a different person here. The quiet, wounded man from the diner was gone, replaced by this formidable commander, a man who moved armies with a few words. When he finally hung up, he turned to her, and the weariness in his posture was the first genuine thing she had seen since he'd appeared at her door. He saw the fear in her eyes, the way she clutched her mug like a shield, and something inside him broke. He crossed the vast room and knelt before her, a gesture of supplication, so shocking it left her speechless. "I am so sorry, Naomi," he said, his voice raw with an emotion she couldn't decipher. "I brought a storm to your door. I crashed into your life, and I have ruined your peace. That is a debt I can never repay." "Why?" she whispered, the only word she could manage. "Why are you doing all this? The cars, this place, protecting me. You could have just disappeared. I would have been fine." "No," he said, shaking his head. "Thorn would have found you, and I could not disappear. All night, in your diner, listening to the storm, it was the first time I have felt peace in 20 years. You showed me a kindness I thought was a myth, a fairy tale. You looked at me and you didn't see power or money or fear. You saw a person who was hurt, and you helped." He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before gently touching her arm. His touch was warm, tentative. "When I was delirious," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "I kept dreaming I was drowning in a frozen river. But then there was a light, a warmth. It was you. You were the light." His eyes, dark and intense, held hers. "I find myself wanting to stay in that light. I will not let anyone harm you or your child. I will protect this peace you have shown me, even if it means tearing my own world apart to do so." It was a confession, more intimate and profound than a simple declaration of love. It was an admission of his own emptiness and the hope she had unknowingly ignited within him. The war with Thorn was swift and silent. Naomi saw none of it, shielded as she was in the sterile luxury of the penthouse. But she felt the tremors of it in Minjun's demeanor. He was gone for long stretches, and when he returned, he carried with him the chilling aura of command and the deep, weary lines of a general fighting on too many fronts. His men would speak to him in hushed, urgent tones, showing him data on tablets, their faces grim. Yet, every time he entered the apartment and saw her, a transformation would occur. The hardness would recede from his eyes, the tension would leave his shoulders, and he would ask her, his voice soft, "Did you eat? Is the baby kicking?" One evening, he returned later than usual. He looked exhausted, but there was a finality in his expression she hadn't seen before. He walked over to the window, staring down at the city lights, a glittering tapestry of lives he had fought to keep separate from hers. "It's over," he said quietly. "Thorn is no longer a threat." She had expected to feel relief, but instead, a new kind of uncertainty settled over her. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She was afraid of the answer, afraid of the violence she knew he was capable of. He turned to face her, and she saw in his eyes not the satisfaction of a victor, but the somber reflection of a man who had been forced to look into the abyss. "I did not kill him," he said, as if reading her mind. "I thought about it. The old me would have. It would have been the simplest solution." He walked towards her, stopping a few feet away. "But all I could think about was you in the diner, cleaning my wound. You didn't ask what I did to deserve it. You just helped. You showed me a different kind of strength." He explained that instead of a bloody retaliation, he had used his immense resources to dismantle Thorn's empire from the inside out. He had exposed his corruption to his rivals, leaked incriminating evidence to international authorities, and systematically stripped him of his power, his money, and his allies. He had left Thorn alive but broken, a king with no kingdom, a fate worse than death in their world. I fought his storm not with a bigger storm, but by taking away his wind, Minjun explained. It was cleaner, more permanent. It was his redemption. He had faced the darkness of his world and had chosen a different path, a path illuminated by the memory of her quiet kindness in a snowbound diner. He had protected her not just by eliminating the threat, but by beginning to become a man worthy of her protection. You have changed me, Naomi, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You have made me want to be a better man. With the threat gone, the golden cage of the penthouse began to feel more like a home. The silence was no longer tense but comfortable. They fell into a gentle, domestic rhythm. He would come home from his long days of managing his legitimate and less legitimate businesses, and the first thing he would do was place a hand on her belly, a look of quiet wonder on his face as he felt the baby kick. He learned she liked her tea with 2 sugars, that she loved old jazz music, and that she had a fierce, dry wit that made him laugh, a real, deep laugh that seemed to surprise even himself. One evening, as they sat on the balcony, the city lights twinkling below them like a fallen constellation, he turned to her. He didn't have a ring. There was no grand, rehearsed speech. There was only the quiet sincerity in his dark eyes. I don't want to go back to my old life, he said, his voice steady. And I have no right to ask you to be a part of it. But I am selfish enough to want to try. I want the life you talked about in the diner. A life of safety and warmth. A family, he took her hand, his thumbs stroking her knuckles. I know this is insane. We are from different universes. But you are the calmest part of mine. Naomi, will you build a new universe with me? Will you marry me? Tears welled in Naomi's eyes. She thought of her lonely apartment, of her constant worry about the future, of the fear of raising a child alone. And she looked at this powerful, complicated man who looked at her not as a waitress or a damsel in distress, but as his equal, his anchor. Yes, she whispered, the word feeling more right than anything she had ever said. Yes, Minyoon. I will. Their wedding was not a spectacle for his world. It was a small, intimate ceremony held in the conservatory of his penthouse, filled with thousands of white orchids. Pearl was there, her eyes shining with pride, having been flown in on a private jet, a fact she found both appalling and thrilling. Naomi wore a simple, elegant ivory dress that draped beautifully over her 8-month bump. Minjun, in a classic black tuxedo, looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. As they said their vows, looking out over the sprawling city, it felt like the closing of one story and the beginning of another. After the ceremony, as the sun began to set, they stood on the balcony. Minjun came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her, his hands resting protectively over hers on her stomach. The fleet of 135 cars was gone, replaced by a quiet promise of a different kind of protection. He was no longer a mafia boss sheltering in a storm. She was no longer a pregnant waitress working a lonely night shift. They were a family, forged in a blizzard, and ready to face any storm that came their way, together.